Welcome to Life in the Law on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we're going to talk about Rosalie Abella, a judge of the Canadian Supreme Court, retired, and it's without precedent from the Holocaust to the Supreme Court of Canada. Our guest is, of course, Rosalie Abella. Welcome, Rosie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here in Hawaii and on your show.
I'm so happy to have you here. I'll skip right to the important stuff, in my view, anyway. The judges in Canada and in the US can and should be our moral leaders, and we need to meet them like you. We need to learn from them. We need to share ideas from them. So the first question is, you're kind of a liberal, I think, and you have a lot of causes in your CV. Were you able to express those causes and advance Canada in those directions while you were sitting on the bench?
Well, first of all, judges don't have causes. I mean, to be in favor of the law that you are implementing, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, our Constitution, is not a cause. It's my job. It was my job. And even, one of the things that's been intriguing for me here in the United States, and I think it's happening everywhere, is that we use terminology to presumptively dismiss the other side's ideas. So small L liberal, probably more than small R right. But what's been interesting to me, Jay, is that I grew up in Canada, went to law school in the late 60s and started practicing law in the 70s. When it was mainstream, everybody was in favor of human rights. Everybody was in favor of the post-World War II small L liberal democratic values that we found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was mainstream. Everybody said, we got to figure out how to start bringing in these people that we had kept out. So that wasn't called left. It wasn't called right. It was called mainstream. I don't hear the word middle anymore. It's become, I think the right very cleverly changed the rhetoric so that what used to be mainstream is now called left, which is a very clever way of dismissing in advance the ideas. And the polarity that's being created is the idea that judges have causes, that there's the left-wing point of view and there's the right-wing point of view. When I was growing up, it was the mainstream point of view. And people who were opposed to protecting rights were on the fringe. So it's been interesting for me at my age and stage to see the world kind of turn upside down, everything that I grew up and that everybody I knew grew up believing in. The press was on board. Everybody was on board because we'd seen what happens when you drop rights and when you defer rights to authoritarian governments. So it wasn't even a contest that anybody really felt comfortable with. There were debates about the economy. I mean, the old Hayek versus Keynes approaches to the economy, for sure, always. But I don't think it was ever, there were preferences. There were people who thought this is the right way to go. But we didn't completely negate the possibility of discussion, of compromise, of a way forward that would include everyone's points of view if you could. So here we are now, two sides. They don't talk to each other. They don't understand each other. I don't understand what's going on in your country now, Jay, I have to say, as a jurist, as a former jurist, and now as a law professor. It makes no sense to me. This is the end of law, never mind justice. It's laws are kind of expendable toys that you throw out when you don't like them. So you started with judges. I have been impressed by the extent to which I have seen most judges in this country, whom I would not say left or right, so far protecting the justice system and the public expectation that they will be fairly treated, despite their small p or capital P partisan affiliation. So they are transcendently protecting the public interest, which is their job. So they're not advancing causes, they are advancing the importance of justice and the public notion that there is such a thing and that it will be protected in spite of what the state does. That's why we have constitutions, to create guardrails around the state and have independent arbiters about when you've crossed the lines. Um, anyway, I'm not going to talk about your Supreme Court, but so far, the judges across the country have been very protective of the public's right to fair process and to independent adjudication by independent judges.
Across the country so far. I like that condition so far.
Well, I'm old enough now to know that things I used to be smug about, starting in my 20s when I knew the answer to everything, I've developed shades of gray along the way. And I know the arc of history can surprise us, as it has me in the last few years, not just in the United States. The autocratic tendency globally is really to someone who was born in 1946, right after, and whose parents survived the concentration camps. Um, I thought that was the trajectory we were always going to be on because people remembered, but they don't remember. And it works for some. And the fact that it works for some seems to give the sense that if it works for me, who cares whether it works for everybody else? Which again contradicts the whole liberal democratic approach, where you do as much as you can for as many as you can.
So, what was your contribution, do you think, to the court and to Canada while you were sitting there for all that time?
Oh, you can't ask me. I mean, that I am I can't judge my own judgments. I think you have to ask other people. And I've always thought that judges are judged by time. History will tell me and you whether I did the right thing in the judgments. I did my best, and I thought I was doing my best. I worked really hard, as did all of my colleagues. Never met a judge who didn't. And I thought this was uh, the better answer of the competing arguments that were put in front of me. But what is my contribution? I don't know, but I did feel along the way, because of when I was born, because of when I became a lawyer, because of when I became a judge, that I was standing on the shoulders of colleagues who had gone before me in the Canadian Supreme Court, who were very robust in their interpretation of our new Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We did not have constitutionally protected rights in Canada until 1982, when Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father of the current Prime Minister, brought them to Canada, and they became part of our Constitution. And right out of the gate, the Canadian Supreme Court uh, was very muscular in protecting rights and striking down criminal code prohibitions against abortion, in defining equality in a new way, in sometimes for the accused, sometimes for the state. They were really quite extraordinary, and I think Canada became, as a result of largely their work and their precedents, which we followed and expanded on, the leading constitutional court in the world. I mean, it's quite sad to see that the American Supreme Court, which was my um, juridical tutor when I was going to law school, I read the decisions of the Warren Court and really loved the way they protected rights. Uh, it's just kind of sad to see that that's not any longer the trajectory, but it was for Canada. And because it stopped being for the United States, other constitutional courts around the world, we all talk to each other, including Americans. Um, but we follow each other's precedents. The Americans tend to not follow anybody's precedents. And remember, I'm Chevy Chase and you're not. So, uh, but I think Canada's approach, its strong protective approach to constitutionally protected rights, became a world leader. And the American constitutional approach, which was more sclerotic about the protection of rights and even took away rights that were pre-existing and settled, is not the approach that any other constitutional court around the world takes so far.
You know, Rosie, they say you're the Canadian version of RGB. On the other hand, there are people who say that RGB was the American version of Rosie. So which is more correct?
Well, I'm flattered that they're comparing me to a great jurist. RBG was um, her dissents were very powerful and really very strong. I think an argument can and has been made about the timing of her departure, but on the other hand, Jay, I in a way I blame the system. We have mandatory retirement in Canada. Every Western democracy has either mandatory retirement at 70, 75, or term limits on the theory that you have a sell by date. I knew when I became a judge in 1976 that on my 75th birthday, if I lived that long, I was out July the 1st, 2021. I knew that for all 45 years that I was a judge. And so I wasn't sad. I wasn't debating. I wasn't deliberating. But if you have a system that says you decide when you are no longer able to make a contribution, you're going to have a hard time getting people to say, oh, okay, I'm not doing a good job anymore. So you can get rid of me. If the system doesn't work, you need a system that says this is your term, do your best during that term, and then it's somebody else's turn. That's healthy, the turnover. So in a way, I can see why people who have no term limit struggle with when they should go, because it goes against human nature to acknowledge that you are no longer a contributing uh, important part of an institution you work with and care about.
Oh, you would support term limits in the United States, in the federal courts, and in the Supreme Court?
I support the system that every other democratic country in the West has. But on the other hand, I'm a Canadian, and um, Americans are not really open to the embrace of other jurisdictions and the precedents of other countries. So it doesn't really matter what I think or what other Western democracies think. Um, the Americans are going to do it their own way. The judges do it their own way, and now the government is doing it. It's following very bizarre precedents to me.
And for me, and for everybody I know, you went to Harvard after you retired from the Supreme Court of Canada.
Right?
Why Harvard? Why the United States? You could have, Rosie, you could have gone anywhere to teach, but it was Harvard. Why Harvard?
They asked. And Harvard is a fantastic law school, and I never dreamed in a million years that I would be lucky enough to be part of that extraordinary faculty at Harvard Law School. So that's been my whole career, Jay. I tell law students, do not sit in your classroom and say, one day I want to be on the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeal. You have no idea what fate has in store, and you have no idea what you're going to enjoy doing. And if you're afraid of risk, you may not get anything that you want because it's the eye of the needle if you've got this one goal. So I went to law school because my father had been a lawyer, a graduate of the Jagiellonian Law School in Krakow. Wasn't allowed to practice in Canada because he wasn't a citizen, but worked for the Americans, taught himself English after the war, and worked for the Allies in Stuttgart. He was head of the Jewish community in Stuttgart, and he was also working for them to help develop legal services for displaced persons. All of his interactions with Americans was positive. He always spoke lovingly about the United States. And so I grew up in a home that was very proud to be Canadian, very grateful to Canada for the life that it gave us. But also, I loved the United States. Now, remember that Steinberg cartoon which said New York and then everybody else?
Oh,
Well,
sure.
okay. Well, to me, America was New York, Broadway, the arts, the culture, Hollywood. I read every book about Broadway and every book about Hollywood, and I read American writers. So I was always enchanted by, enthralled by Americans. So I also think Canadians have great law schools. But when uh, one of the top law schools in the world says, "Would you like to come and teach?" And it was a wonderful dean, John Manning, I hadn't met before. I jumped at it. I couldn't believe how lucky I was to be able to be at that law school. I just have reveled in the company I'm in there with some of the finest legal minds. I used to cite them all the time in my opinions. And here I am, and they turn out not to be brilliant, but wonderful people. So just lucky, like my whole career, which comes back to my point. Every time, do you remember Sammy Kahn? Remember the Tin Pan Alley songwriter? Somebody once said to him, "Mr. Kahn, what came first, the words or the music?" And he said, "The phone call." And that was my career. They called me and they said, "You want to be a family court judge? Sure. You want to run the labor board, even though you don't know very much about labor law? Sure. You want to run the law reform commission? Okay." Um, I knew I would learn. Even when I didn't know, I was ready to ask questions. I had the humility that comes from um, knowing that there were a lot of people who knew a lot more than I did, and I was never afraid to ask questions. And then I got appointed to the Court of Appeal miraculously because there were two vacancies. And then because I wasn't ever dreaming of going to the Supreme Court of Canada, I wrote strong decisions about the first appellate decisions, in fact, in Canada on gay rights, labor rights, women's rights, because they might have been career enders for the Supreme Court, but there was no way an immigrant, refugee Jewish woman was going to the Supreme Court. So it wasn't risk taking. I did my job without worrying about what the career implications were. And I ended up on the Supreme Court of Canada because there were two vacancies. So they appointed two women. One was a really good, solid jurist, and I was the other one. And I think they could afford to take me because they had a good, solid, wonderful uh, jurist. So I, I didn't plan my legal career. I didn't plan on Harvard, but I went where I was asked to go, and I have never looked back. I mean, I have no regrets about any of the risks. They were all risks. I could have fallen flat on any of them, but they were. I worked really hard, Jay. This is what you do when you're not born to it, um, and I always gave it my all. And I don't think I ever didn't have wonderful people I could learn from and did. So here I am now at 78, collectively the beneficiary of the generosity of a lot of very good people. Um, my parents, to start, my extraordinary husband, lucky with two amazing young sons. They're 51 and 48, but they're both lawyers and they're great people. That's I put that down to luck. And here I am talking to you. Um, I'm crazy about your brother and sister-in-law. I think they're amazing people. Meeting them was good luck, and meeting you was good luck.
Yeah, let's talk about Linda Greenhouse, my sister-in-law.
Oh my
Um,
God.
it was a couple of years ago, you wrote an article with her entitled "The Judicial Response to Terrorism from Within and Without in Urgency and Legitimacy." Now, that's one of many, many, many articles you've written, and you've written a number of books too. But can you talk about that article for a moment?
Let me talk about her rather than the article. When I met her, I was in awe of her already because she was to me. Tony Lewis was the first extraordinary uh, writer. We didn't have that in Canada. So I read Tony Lewis and then I discovered Linda Greenhouse. And I thought then, and I think now, that there has never been a finer interpreter of the legal and judicial system anywhere than Linda Greenhouse. And it isn't just because her insights are so visionary and sound. She always has an evidentiary foundation for what she writes, and she's not a lawyer, but she gets it better than most lawyers I know do. I always learn something, but she's also one of the most wonderful people. Like, she's a mensch. She's very humane, she's very compassionate, and she's very brilliant. So what's not to like? And she's married to a fabulous guy who was all of the above as well. So that was something we did for a seminar of constitutional judges from around the world. And it was getting at the heart of what to do when you're faced with existential threats to your country. What do you do about protecting rights in the face of those very real threats? Do you abandon them in the name of well, it's just it is a larger form of what criminal lawyers do all the time. Do you abandon concepts like presumption of innocence because you're dealing with something gargantuan, as opposed to merely murder? Or you're always, as a judge, confronted with your passions and your duty. So it was just making sure that although we understood the agitations, the very real agitations of living in fear from these kinds of threats, you still had to keep your brain on the ground and do what you have to do to make sure justice is served and protected, rather than giving in to whim. I mean, judges, you could have people deciding cases, right? Just, I feel like it is not a legal concept that we respect in democracies. So judges have to transcend the the agonies of a case and decide based on the facts and the law as best they can. So that's what we were talking about, and exchanging ideas with judges from around the world who were dealing not only with 9/11. Aaron Barak was there, and he said, you have September the 11th, we have September 11th, September 12th, September 13th. So exchanging ideas with people, with other judges from around the world who were dealing with many of these same problems, and to do it with her, and she took the lead on it. Um, was just kind of learning from, like, being an artistic apprentice and learning from the master, if you could use that word anymore. So I always look for chances to see and be with her and Jean, because they are such extraordinary people, and they care so deeply about the democratic institutions and the justice institutions, and keeping justice uppermost in the mind. It's why we have democracy. It's why you have checks and balances, so that people's rights are protected, whether they're the richest or the poorest. We're just forgetting the poorest and the most vulnerable. And to me, there's no justice until you put the vulnerable at the center of your justice system. It's all about the vulnerable. It's all about, majorities have legislatures to go to. Legislatures represent the wishes of the majorities. They're elected or unelected, depending on whether they do what the majority wants. Judges are the people who are not elected, except in your country, but most judges are not elected. And they are not elected because they are supposed to be independent of the wishes of the majority. Public opinion is at the table, but it doesn't have a veto. And so judges rise above what they think of as public opinion, whatever that means. We don't take polls. So I know what my friends think. I don't know that that's public opinion. But we're supposed to confront the facts and the law in front of us, regardless of public opinion. Legislatures can't afford to do that. So unless we stay true to what our mission is and our mandate is as judges, as independent, as checks and balances on what the state does, there's no point.
Well, we've only scratched the surface, Rosie. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But I do want to mention that you've been at the law school this week,
I
expressing
have
yourself on these things. And you've also, I'm sure you express these things to your classes at Harvard, and hopefully they'll get the message and carry forward with these same ideas. And what you are saying today is probably, although I haven't seen it, expressed in your documentary, which Barry Average would like to call "Everything's Coming Up Rosie," but in fact, in fact, you guys have called it Rosalie Abella without precedent. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rosie.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to meet you, Jay.
I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Aloha.
Thanks, Jay.